So we start now. Charles and everyone, welcome to our monthly Innovation, Knowledge and Inclusive Development Seminar series at the Open University. I am Dinar Kale. I am Professor of Innovation and Development at here at the OU. We are very delighted to have an amazing seminar and a speaker with us today to kickstart our most probably the 20th seminar series. um, it's been funded from the research center, the SSGS Research Center, and it's part of the Development and Economic Research stream. The speaker for today we have is Dr. Charles Balihir. He's a senior lecturer at the senior lecturer of strategic management at the Open University Business School. And Charles is going to present on leveraging the electric mobility to accelerate energy access in African countries. Really interesting subject. I guess, Charles, some of this research is also supported by Open Societal Challenges funding in the Open University. And we are really looking forward to hearing your views and thoughts about that, Charles. Before starting, some rules. This video is being recorded and will be available for playback after, so people who don't want to be featured can ask questions in Q&A and ask to remain anonymous. Um, all the participants are being automatically muted, but please raise your hands if you want to ask questions. The format of the seminar series is that we will have Charles giving a presentation for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will open it for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat as well, and we will mop them up towards the end after the seminar is after in the Q&A sessions as well. There is an X account which we'll put in the chat, which you can also follow us and get the new development. Thanks everyone, and over to you, Charles. Now I will switch off my camera and keep the mic.
Thank you so much, Dina. Thank you, everyone, for coming in. Dina has already introduced the topic and me, so it's about leveraging electric mobility to accelerate energy access in African countries. Thank you so much for honoring our invite to come. And let me try to put this in presentation mode for you to see better. So here is a bit of the agenda that we shall use for today. So we shall have a bit of background to the whole topic. It has been informed by work in progress, so there will be a research question and a bit of explanation of the methodology that I'm using to gather data and analyze it. I'll talk about the onset of the global electric vehicle transition, usually shortened to EV, a changing market of used EVs, game-changing opportunity for African countries, which is at the core of the seminar today. The Global Battery Alliance and its principles, the current situation on battery repurposing, the early status of electric mobility in African countries. And then I'll talk about some work we are doing here at the OU around what we call the energy hub model and its implications, and then I'll make some conclusions. So what is this all about? You've certainly come across this somehow, that many sub-Saharan African countries are struggling to meet multiple UN SDGs by 2030. It's looking very unlikely that they will meet the goals. Some progress has been made, as you know, but there's still a lot to be done. In particular, SDG 7, universal access to affordable and clean energy is falling very short. If you look at the numbers, we have over 600 million people on the African continent. That's over 50% of the region's population still having either no access or very limited access to electricity. So you can do the mathematics, what needs to happen for us to achieve universal access by 2030. The need is especially critical in rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa. And there you can see some figures. You can see a chart that tries to demonstrate what's happening with access in urban areas as compared to rural areas. It's not too bad on average in urban areas, but the situation, so that black line at the bottom in rural areas is very unfortunate. In fact, that's an average. There are some countries where in rural areas you have as little as just 11% of the population there having access to electricity. So rural areas is a key area of interest for any effort to change the situation. So many efforts are underway, but like I said before, very unlikely that we shall achieve universal access. And this has implications for other SDGs, for example, SDG 13 on climate action. And so in this seminar, we want to try to look at one of the possible innovative solutions to address this issue around repurposing batteries. So I'll be saying a lot of things around repurposing batteries from electric vehicles and what that means for efforts to improve access to energy and electricity. And so, like I say, this is work in progress. Here is a guide, an overall research question I've been using to inform my work on this. So to what extent can the global electric vehicle transition be leveraged to improve access to energy in sub-Saharan Africa? This has been the core question I've had. And I've been involved with the energy with energy questions on the continent for a long time. Previously, I did my PhD in pro-market reforms in the sector. I've done some work in solar technologies, which are becoming very important. But of recent, I'm more interested in electric vehicles because I see a link with improving access. So that's the sort of background to that question. And for a start, I've relied on content analysis, so looking at government reports. There's a lot of work going on with development aid agencies, both bilateral and multilateral, especially the World Bank, of course. There's a lot of work in this area. Academic publications is still a lot. It's an early, an early. It's a young area, so there's not so much, but there's some work coming up. Yeah, so many actors, stakeholders who are getting more and more interested in this. There's some publications. So I've been looking at that and using qualitative content analysis, especially. Interviews with the energy experts, startup entrepreneurs, policymakers. And I've been having some workshops. We've been doing some workshops as part of developing bids and developing a network around this. So all this has been informing my understanding of this young industry on the continent. The EV transition overall is a key element in our efforts to tackle the global climate change crisis, as you know. So it's considered very critical that we shift from using internal combustion engines, so those ones which are based on petrol and fossil fuels generally, and shift to electric vehicles as a critical ingredient of the strategy to address the climate crisis. And here in the UK, the previous government had a target to stop all registrations of new ICE by 2035. The new government has in its manifesto that it wants to achieve this by 2030. So it will be interesting to see that the UK takes the lead on that. Most of the EUs are targeting 2035. So if the UK can achieve this in 2030, I think that will be really exemplary, and the UK might become a benchmark in that. Unfortunately, not all regions globally are doing as well. So most of the work that's going on is in Europe, some Asian countries, and North America. Those are the core areas. And you can see there in that chart, which indicates what has been happening in around the world in terms of adoption of electric vehicles. So that's mainly Europe, US, China, Japan, South Korea, and the rest of the world is just, of course, put together is significant. But then if you look at individual countries, this not so much. But the interesting thing here is that exponential growth has started setting in. So you can see there 2025, we are starting to see, the typical indication of exponential growth. When this chart was made, it was a projection, but now we already have some real figures. You can see here, these are real figures from 2010. And again, you can clearly see that exponential growth is setting in. We are currently around 16%. So the figure here we have is 2022, but the most recent is about 16% market share of EVs among all passenger car sales. So that's a very good tendency, very good progress, but we still have a long way to go, as you can imagine. But the general direction is good. Unfortunately, of course, Sub-Saharan Africa and Africa generally is still behind. It's also catching up. You can see that chart on the right. It's catching up. The numbers are looking better, but in comparison to what's happening elsewhere, it is low. So currently, the total number of EVs on the continent is around 2024 only, and most of it in South Africa, over 60% of this. So the rest of the continent is struggling. There's still a lot of work to do there to to make sure the transition is taking place there too. But with the first generation of EVs in more developed countries starting to change hands, so those first models are now reaching their, a predicted lifetime, normal lifetime, and changing hands as second-hand vehicles. There's hope that Africa may tap into this possibility, and so the general thinking is that. Given that most people, are on low income, there's no way you're going to have many people buying new EVs on the continent. So they are going to depend almost certainly on second or third hand vehicles. The good thing, the continent is already market leader in terms of used vehicles. So there's a lot of experience around that. But also some risks because, how to deal with the batteries that are in these vehicles is a question that is up there in the air, which I'll talk a bit more about that later. But very importantly, this has implications also for dealing with the dire transport situation on the continent and its implications. And on the next slide, I give an example of one of the cities on the continent as Greater Kampala. You can see the situation, and there may be one or two people in the audience from Uganda. I think you will have recognized that it can be catastrophic almost, the congestion, the emissions, the accidents that happen, so there's a lot that needs to happen. This is a typical picture of urban areas all over the continent. So if we can get the EV transition working on the continent and also bring in its economies and efficiencies, it will have fundamental implications for all these areas presented on the slide here. And also another indication of some good news here again, coming back to here in our home area here in Britain, this slide on the left depicts the price of used EVs in the UK in the past 8 quarters. You can see there's been a dramatic fall in prices. So here we use 2 models, 2-year-old Polestar 2 and a 2-year-old Tesla Model 3, compared to a 3-year-old petrol BMW 4 Series Grand Coupe. You can see we have reached a critical point, Q1 24, that second-hand EVs have become cheaper at least in this graph, than second-hand fossil fuel powered vehicle. That is very, very good news. If this trend can continue, then of course there's going to be interest to start using these vehicles, provided the charging infrastructure situation is also addressed, which is still a limiting factor. But this is very good news to see that these vehicles are becoming price competitive for the consumers, and on the right, you have some absolute figures. Used EV sales in Britain over since 2020. So you can see the numbers are looking good. Yeah. So what does this all mean? What can we take out of all this? The thing is that when you have an electric vehicle, that battery in there at some point, its capacity comes down. It comes down to keeps coming down, degrading. That's the word that's used technically. And when it reaches 70 to 80% rest battery capacity, it is no longer very efficient in the vehicle, in an electric vehicle. So you then have to think of what to do with the battery and of course with the vehicle itself. And so this is where the thinking around repurposing starts, that these batteries still have enough capacity for other purposes. And so there's been some work that's going on around this. What can we do with these batteries? That's a very critical point in what we are looking at today, how these batteries can be used to address that question we started with of the need on the African continent. So they are no longer usable in electric vehicles, but they can be repurposed. That means they are remanufactured and used for something else that requires lower capacity in a second and third life. It depends on what is called the state of health of these batteries. Within batteries, you have cells and modules. So you would need to be able to determine the state of health by looking at all these cells and modules. Some work has been done around that, and there's still ongoing work. And then we start talking of stationary storage. So once you've determined the state of health of these cells and modules, and you've put them together again for a second life, usually that is not in a mobile vehicle. It's as stationary storage for various purposes, and I'll talk more about that later. So to be able to do that, you need to be able to understand the calendar life of the battery, the life cycle of the battery, and they're all different models of batteries, over 150 models currently. Yeah, you have to understand the internal resistance of the battery, capacity fade. There's a bit of physics terms, but they are relevant to my research to also understand them in the context of course, strategic management. And here there's been some work around how to tap into the momentum of the global transition that is taking place. So here, one other thing I want to introduce is some work around what's called the Global Battery Alliance. This is an initiative that started with the World Economic Forum in 2017, where various stakeholders along the supply chain of batteries started making thoughts about what's going to happen with these batteries. So the question has been there for a long time. It's been, of concern that we are entering exponential growth, like we saw in those charts that I presented, but we don't yet have very solid solutions how to handle these batteries. And so the Global Battery Alliance was formed. It's been doing some very good work around understanding what to do in various places. And also they've specifically addressed what can be done in sub-Saharan Africa. And one very important thing that I can mention here is what is called the battery passport. So that's a suggestion that batteries can be identified using some kind of code. So each battery can be given a code, which has all its characteristics, its features, its history, That's a very critical initiative initiated by the EU to understand the battery health of these batteries and to capture the data in a way that is you can track, you can monitor. And so there on the right, you have a sample of how such a passport can look like. It has all kinds of information about the type of battery, the durability, the battery model, the weight, how it can be traced, and all kinds of information, which is very critical. The hands that have changed in owning this battery, the vehicle. So this is a very comprehensive piece of, let me call it a data bank for the battery, or which if each battery can be linked to something like this and we can trace it over its lifetime, is very, very critical. So some work is ongoing to make sure that this passport also finds functionality in sub-Saharan Africa as a way of managing the onslaught of thousands of batteries that are going to end up on the continent. So there's ongoing work to address this question, which is critical. It's early work, and so a lot still needs to be done to make sure it is solid before these vehicles start getting on the continent. So here, the Global Battery Association has 10 working principles. I don't need to go through all of them. These slides will be shared, but it has some very, very useful principles. If I can highlight maybe the first three. Fundamentally, that a battery, the productive life of a battery needs to be maximized as part of its first life. So you need to make sure that when that battery comes out from production and you're using it, you maximize that first life before you think of repurposing. However, when you come to that second stage of repurposing, you need to have a possibility to do that. So enabling a productive and safe second life use. So that aspect of transitioning from first to second, and if you like, even third life, is critical to making sure that we get the best out of these batteries safely in a way that can be traced and monitored. And the third principle there is ensuring circular recovery of battery materials, that at the end, what you have that are materials that are not just thrown around, but they can be used for other purposes, and they keep being used as much as possible. So I won't go through the whole list. There are 10 principles there: decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. So I won't go through the 10 principles, but in your own time, you can check that out. And you can refer back to it later on when we have the discussion. Here, going back again to Africa, we often talk of battery chemistries. So there are two core chemistries that are present on the continent in use. We have mainly lead acid batteries. That's the main chemistry currently being used. But also we are starting to see lithium ion batteries. They are already there in smaller versions used in, for example, in solar home systems, in laptops, in other smaller assets, but not so much in vehicles. So here, the early stage refers mainly to use in electric vehicles, which, as we saw, is at a very early stage. And so the table here tries to compare the two chemistries, cycle life. So that's the number of charges and discharges that you can use before this battery comes to a point where it's no longer, productively usable. So lithium-ion batteries have an advantage that you can have over 1,000 cycles, whereas lead acid batteries, you just have, 100. So clearly, lithium-ion batteries are superior there, but also the depth of discharge. That means the extent to which you can use the battery before it becomes unusable in the vehicle. So the one on average, the one for lithium batteries is a bit higher compared to the one in lead acid battery. So you can use that battery longer. And then what's called energy density. So in this case, the energy you can get out of this battery measured on the amount of, the weight you have of the battery. So clearly, again, lithium-ion batteries have a clear advantage. Upfront cost when purchasing is relatively low. I think that's the main advantage of lead acid batteries. They're fairly cheap. It will take some time before lithium-ion batteries can also compete. But as we saw from that evidence from here, from Britain, prices are going down. So we think with time, in a few years' time, lithium-ion batteries will also be competitive in terms of upfront costs. Recyclability of lead acid batteries is quite high. You can very easily, disassemble lead acid batteries and use the materials for various things. The issue in Africa has always been how they do that safely. It's not always very professional, but in principle, recyclability is high. Unfortunately, or if you want, fortunately, lithium-ion batteries, recyclability is not very, very high. So it's very, very complex to break down a lithium battery at the very end for recycling purposes. So that's why they are more suitable for repurposing, whereby you don't break down the whole thing, but sort of you rechannel into other purposes. But in terms of recycling, it's very complex, it's very expensive. So that's one other incentive why there's a push to use them as much as possible before we have to reach that death point, where they completely die off. Here, this is a bit of an overview on the content, what is happening in various areas as far as battery repurposing. There's some work in West Africa, in Benin, Nigeria. There you can see South Africa is quite doing heavy work, some bit of work in Tanzania and Kenya, and also Rwanda. And some initial work is starting in Uganda, but very, very early stage. So the key point here is that for a continent as large as Africa, these are really very few projects taking place, and most of this is based on development aid, so not necessarily projects that are starting to make money. We are reaching that point where these projects can become commercialized, and so that's also something that is coming up as business models are developed to make things viable in business terms. Here, now going into electric vehicles again. So there's a segment called electric motorcycles that is very common on the continent. So usually, often they are called borders. That's a common name on the continent. These have really taken up. Electrification in this area is starting to take place. These motorcycles are affordable. They are maneuverable in very difficult conditions. You can use them in many places, also up country. So they've become quite common, and the people who buy them are also looking for a livelihood because they transport people around, they transport goods very conveniently. So it's like a multitask asset that is there. And so now there's a growing tendency to try to electrify them. So here, the third point here gives view some names of companies on the continent that are going into this. Zembo is active in Uganda. There may be someone in the audience from Zembo. If you're here, you can say something later in the plenary. There's Gogo also in Uganda. There is Ampere's Hand in Rwanda. Spiro is the market lead on the continent. They are in West Africa and East Africa. They already have over 10,000 motorcycles that they are managing. There's ROM in Kenya. So there are some players, but just at the very beginning of trying to electrify vehicles, there's still a long way to go to reach the critical mass of electrified vehicles. And here there's some work from the Model Intelligence, which suggests that by 2030, at the current rate, we shall have 22% of all motorcycles electrified. It's still, in my opinion, a bit low if we are trying to tackle climate change and the issues we are talking about. But given the history, the very early stage of the EV transition on the continent, it's a fairly good start. So this photo is in Kampala, the key road. Those who know Kampala, I'm sure Craig, you could recognize that street, Kampala Road there. You can see some motorcycles by Zembo. I think they were just being tested for something there. So here was another project by another company based in Kenya, ROM. This is quite recent. They tested an electric motorcycle from Nairobi to Stellenbosch in the Republic of South Africa. That's 6,000 kilometers, 17 days with the bike. And of course, there's no infrastructure. So what they did was to have a service vehicle, which would move in front of the motorbike to use solar panels to charge batteries. Then when the motorcycle comes, they change the battery like that. But the point they were making is that it's possible to have these electrified motorbikes doing long distances. So here, the picture just shows very interesting picture. They went through a park, and you can see the elephant there being part of this. And the good thing, which is a side story, that you can do that, but you are not polluting the environment. That these animals can also have an existence with us here on the planet. So this company, ROM, did some very interesting experiment. It's about 2 months ago. Yeah, so some work going on. This second point there, some suggestions that by 2040, 70% of all EVs on the continent will be motorcycles. So that just gives you an indication of how important this segment is for the continent. So there's a work that needs to be done to make sure the rate of electrification is high, really. And of course, it's also a solution to the growing challenges of high, emissions. Yeah, and it's not only electric motorcycles, but there's also some work going on around electric buses. That is a bit more complex. Very early stages, but clearly happening. For example, there's a startup company in Uganda called Chira Motors, and this vehicle, Kayola, is from them. So they've come up with some pioneer work around buses. Very, very early stages, it has to pick up. But if it works, this could help solve the transport issues we saw there previously. But also very important, it would then help with impact in terms of repurposing those batteries from the buses. You can do more with these batteries. Like I'll explain a bit further on another slide. But this is very early work in Uganda, some work in Kenya, and also some work in Rwanda that's taking place around buses. But really, if you look at population growth on the continent and the challenges, especially in urban areas, which they will need buses to help. So motorcycles alone won't be enough to solve the problem. So here, fundamentally for the project is some work we are doing here at the OU. We have a consortium with some people based here in the UK, some companies based in the UK, but some others also based on the continent. We've been thinking about how to address this issue. So our idea is what is called an energy hub, where you have some kind of, it's almost like what we currently have, gas stations or petrol stations, but not using, of course, petrol or any fossil fuel, but instead using renewable energy, and based on getting expired batteries from buses, from trucks, and then placing them at such a hub where you can charge using solar, but also from the main grid for purposes of resilience. And then you can charge various other things. In this case, you can charge those border borders or electric motorcycles I've just talked about. But also you can charge for the community. You can serve the community through this hub. In this particular example, it was like you're serving mainly the households, but you can also do more as part of what is increasingly called productive use of renewable energy. Things like, farmers can come and charge their solar pumps here. They can come, and small businesses can come and charge their batteries here and swap them. And so we are thinking of this as something that can be useful for the transport industry as such. The green circle there and the ellipse, the yellow one, is mainly the community. That if we have that kind of arrangement, there's a lot we can do. Early stages, we are trying to look, of course, for grant money to do something. We are a recipient of the Open Society Challenges funding to do, something around that. We think we are able to do a pilot on the ground and, proof of concept. And so fingers crossed that we get some funding, good funding along the way. And these hubs, of course, can have real value. For skills development, you can attach the skills development center to this to develop EV skills for people to understand what they can do with this, how they can, create a livelihood around it. And so skills development is, value added aspect of these hubs. Depending on where you place them, you can have the cottage industry, you can have batteries that can be swapped and used for all kinds of things, even at night. Most people in rural Africa end up just sleeping the whole night because there's no energy for anything. So if you have such a network, you can do quite a lot. Health, education, and other community institutions, farms, like I mentioned, solar irrigation, mobile community services. An example here is that health entities on the continent, you have many maternal death simply because there's no power in these entities. And so if you had such a hub which can serve, it can actually save life directly. Various micro and small enterprises, and of course households, like I said before. And so coming to the end, in conclusion, we have a potential game changer in the energy access situation in sub-Saharan Africa if we can tap into this EV transition taking place. As you said, there's a lot happening globally, but it still needs to happen more strongly on the African continent. But there are some indications that something is starting to move on the continent itself. We have early stage dynamics. So we need to tap, especially into the exponential phase, as we saw those graphs. So we are going to have thousands, millions actually of batteries around. And so the continent can benefit if we address the risks involved and the potential hazards there. Motorcycles that are at the forefront of this currently. The hubs, like I mentioned, can be very useful entry point for bringing everything together innovatively, because you have effectively technical, business, and social innovations within the hub. Of course, there are still gaps concerning regulation and institutional frameworks. And all this, of course, translates into the research, and there's so many research gaps that I've indicated. So ladies and gentlemen, that is it for now. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk to you. And please, over to you, Dina.
Thanks a lot, Charles, for that very informative and insightful presentation of on the energy access in Africa using the repurposing of the batteries. I guess we can open the forum for questions. Those who have any questions, please raise your hands or put that in the chat, and we can I will take one by one. Um, just to ask something to kickstart the conversation, Charles. You
Right.
might have mentioned about the role of government, but I just wanted to curious about what sort of incentives or what sort of policies the state governments or the even the African Union it's been it's to do this transition. Do you sort of repurpose? Are they making an investment? Are they giving any incentives? Uh,
Mm.
uh, so what's your take on that?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tina. Very, very important question. So yes, I think there's ongoing work effectively by all governments at different levels because they are starting to see the potential of this, especially as the population, the continent has the highest population growth rate global, and they see that in a few years' time they're going to have challenges. So they're starting to get prodded to think what to do. The African Union is there, what's called Agenda 2063, addresses some of this and sees this as also an important aspect. The African Development Bank has a fund, into this to try to support commercialization of things, but also initially some projects. Those countries I mentioned, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and also that map I showed, some work in South Africa, also in West Africa. Those projects are being like benchmarks for what can happen in other countries. So yes, there's some work going on as people see, for example, these electric motorcycles that actually, when you use an electric motorcycle, it is cheaper, it's cleaner, but also long term, you get more profit out of it than what you would have been paying. So there are some finance models that have demonstrated that this is actually a more useful model. So yes, there's quite some good work going on around this.
Thanks. We have a question from Lucy. Go ahead.
Yes, please, Lucy.
Hi, Charles, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. So my question relates a bit to what Dina just asked, actually. So he asked a bit about the regulatory framework, and I wondered, particularly when you're talking about the export of secondhand batteries from Europe to various countries in Africa, what are the rules around, for instance, import tariffs in the different countries? And can you say a bit more about the sort of ownership of the supply chain? So who's owning the batteries, who's buying them, who's selling them, who are the companies, actors involved in all of this? I suppose I'm coming from a kind of political economy side of
Yes.
things, so I'd just be interested to know a bit more about all of that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Lucy. That's if I may use the terminology, the elephant in the room about ownership. And this passport I talked about and the Global Battery Alliance, they've been pushing hard that there must be very, very stringent rules before any batteries can move from the rest of the world to Africa. In this case in Europe, where they have most influence. So there's been a lot of work around that about, it's not yet complete what kind of specific rules should apply, but there's work ongoing to concretize that not only should we know the rules, what's going to happen, who is going to own. So the thinking right now is that um, you have some companies or the manufacturers or whatever being the ones to take the batteries for use on the continent. And also after use, after these batteries have reached their final end of life, they are brought back to, in this case, Europe. That's sort of the thinking. There's been some other thinking that actually maybe there should be investment that when these batteries reach the end of life, instead of transporting them back, you should set up infrastructure within the continent itself, because you're also then creating jobs and developing skills. So it's an ongoing debate, but currently the emphasis is on bringing back the dead batteries to where they came from. That's because these countries are at a very early stage, they may get overwhelmed if we leave these batteries there. So until we reach that point where we are confident they can manage, possibly that's the direction to go in. I don't know whether that helps. It's a bit of a very large debate, like I said, elephant in the room. So maybe I may not be able to answer it exhaustively right now.
Yeah, an elephant in the room and a can of worms as well, I think.
Yes.
Thanks for that.
Right.
That's really fascinating because I think, Lucy, both the questions about regulatory frameworks and the supply chains are really critical in this area. And, I think it will be interesting to have more conversations around that as we go forward. I think there was a hand by Theo. Theo, you have?
Yes,
Yeah,
thanks. Hi,
yeah.
Charles. Yes, well, actually, my question was on that as well, on the potential trade-offs, and one of them is, as you said, what do you do with the dead batteries? Because these are low-capacity batteries; they will run out of capacity very soon unless you have in place infrastructure for what you termed circular recovery of battery materials. Then you might end up basically developing another problem, which is polluting basically the area where you store those batteries. So I was wondering whether there has been any kind of discussion there. I mean, I guess getting the batteries back to Europe will depend on supply chains and contracts, but is there any discussion about those trade-offs?
Yeah, there is ongoing discussion, starting with deciding what kind of batteries you want to bring. So that passport I talked about, it is based on you understanding what is the state of health. I use the term state of health in the presentation, that you can tell roughly, even start predicting how long can this battery work for particular purposes. For example, if you are going to place it as part of backup storage for a hospital, are you going to use it for a school, whatever, that you can develop an understanding that you can predict, you can even track, you can even monitor all the way from Europe what's happening to the battery. And then there can be a third life after it has served in the hospital, the school. You can disassemble it and take out what doesn't work and assemble it into an even smaller unit for something else, as part of the circular economy perspective. So in other words, the thinking is that you should only bring to the continent what can work over a long period of time. As technology develops, as we start understanding what can be done, and as skills within the continent itself are developed. So that's roughly what has been happening, but also to understand that within the continent itself, you're going to start seeing more and more vehicles, maybe more people starting to afford these things, that there's going to be a dynamic there. This is very interesting. Maybe at some point it may become unnecessary to transport these batteries all the way from Europe or from other parts of the world. But that is far off. If you measure it on the need that we have of people who have no electricity and energy, it will take some time to achieve that. But we have pockets of work going on, for example, in Uganda as part of our project. In Rwanda. Rwanda is doing very good work together with Volkswagen and Siemens. Some work they're doing there, but also in Kenya. But all of it at very early stages, not yet at scale for the whole continent. So, but yes, that's a very important observation, Theo.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. Just one more question from me, Charles, is about,
Yes, Dean.
I mean, I'm not much an expert on EV, and but what I've read in the newspaper is more about China emerging as the main, the maker of the EV cars, and I just wanted to see, and you did mention about Europe a lot in your, whether there is any sort of a relationship with Chinese about this sort of a repurposing of. I mean, we have a colleague who works, Frankton, who works in China in Africa and looks at the energy access in that way. So, is there any sort of a connection with basically repurposing of the EV batteries and the Chinese investment in Africa? Do you see any of that happening in the future or happening now?
Yes. Yeah, very important question, Dina. Thank you. Yes, there's a lot of course going on with China involved in all sorts of things, starting with the minerals themselves. The cobalt, we didn't even talk about, what's used in the batteries. So they are very much involved. They have an interest. But they are also involved now in some models of electric vehicles starting to come on the continent, including the electric motorcycles I mentioned. So there's competition between China and India actually around this. So very interesting. Maybe it's good to have that competition. But yes, China is very much involved. They tend to be a bit, as you know, not so, they don't want to push these governments as traditionally Europe and America does on these governments as far as what they want to do. They tend to leave it to them. It can have its advantages and disadvantages. But they are there. I think the fact that they are global market leader has implications. They are quite ahead, as you saw in some of the graphs. And so we are potentially likely to have also vehicles coming from there, so we may end up having competing markets in this. But I think I miss China being more active in this aspect of what's going to happen, really. In China itself, they're doing a lot of work around this. But what's going to happen to their partners on the continent itself, I miss a bit of that, to be honest. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Charles. I'm just looking if anyone has other questions.
I'm sorry, I don't see the chat, so I leave it to you to sensitize me to any. Yeah.
No, I think people have asked the questions rather than put them in the chat. So I'm keeping an eye on the chat as well. I think it's really fascinating what you've been discussing. So I guess if there are no more questions, we can come to close the seminar. Again, thanks, Charles, for your really insightful and interesting presentation on this area. I think there is a lot of scope to sort of have discussions, and maybe we can think about doing a workshop around these areas about, say, regulatory frameworks, supply chains, and the issues and the Chinese involvement. So thanks for that, and I thanks everyone who's attended the workshop, seminar today.